Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Command & Conquer Red Alert 2 Yuri's Revenge for PC. This is the expansion pack to the real-time strategy game Command & Conquer Red Alert 2. It was developed by Westwood and published by EA in August of 2001, and it's interesting because of its subject matter, which is, of course, of the psychic Yuri trying to dominate the world and everything, but I'll get to that more when I get to the plot. And it's also interesting because it introduces a new faction, which is of course Yuri's faction, at least in skirmish mode, and it has an entirely new campaign. So this is actually pretty much the first game in the entire series to get a full-on proper expansion pack, as opposed to just pretty much a mission pack with maybe a few units thrown in there for good measure, a la Tiberian Sun Firestorm, or the Aftermath expansion for Red Alert 1. So the question becomes, with that evolution to a full-on, proper expansion pack, does the expansion pack actually add anything worth having to the game? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's pretty much exactly the same as Red Alert 2, which is to be expected. This is only an expansion pack, after all. It's not an entirely new engine or anything like that. So that comes with both the same good things from the upgrade to the Tiberian Sun and, of course, Red Alert 2 version of that engine, as well as the same detriments. You see, you still have the issue of it not properly doing the whole units behind buildings thing, and you also have the problem of this game being ludicrously unstable on modern operating systems, at least on Windows 7 64-bit, and good luck on Windows 8 and newer than that. But this thing is actually more unstable than base Red Alert 2 is. Believe it or not, I actually cannot run Yuri's Revenge for longer than about 10 minutes at a time. If that. It crashes constantly, and it is infuriating to deal with that. Now, once again, that issue is more in the skirmish mode than it is in the single player. Single player will last a bit longer than skirmish mode, but skirmish mode just crashes every single time I try to play it, and it's downright infuriating. So, despite the presentation being pretty much the exact same as the base Red Alert 2, it's less stable somehow. And once again, it's got the FMV cutscenes. They're higher quality than the previous games. It's the same quality as Red Alert 2, and with the same kind of cheesy acting, although they cheese it up a lot more in this game considering the subject matter. And the sound design is still fantastic in the music department, still Frank Klepacki's soundtrack, still a lot of heavy industrial kind of stuff, and it works really well for the game. Still a lot of corniness and humor to the voice acting as well, so that all lends the game quite a lot of charm. But as much charm as the game has, ultimately it comes down to the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is completely bonkers. Once again, you have the Allied and Soviet campaigns, and they both have to deal with the Yuri faction, which is, if you don't remember from the original Red Alert 2, Yuri was the advisor to the Soviet Premier Romanov, and he was a psychic. So the Soviets in Red Alert 2 had some interesting psychic gameplay to go along with them, and this time around, you actually have the entire new Yuri faction. Unfortunately, there is not a single-player campaign for the Yuri faction. You are only fighting against him, whether you're fighting as the Allies or as the Soviets. And the plot basically starts out after the events of Red Alert 2, where it's assumed the Allied ending, and Yuri pops up during a meeting with the American president and basically is all like, well, I'm going to be a James Bond villain and have these psychic dominators all over the world that will bring the entire world underneath my grasp of psychic energy, and so on and so forth. And so, of course, the president orders an attack on the psychic dominators, and only marginal success is achieved there. So what ends up happening is that you had to go back in time and try to prevent Yuri from rising to power. And like I said, it's completely bonkers. You're dealing with weird time travel nonsense, you're dealing with psychics. It really goes off the deep end here, and it's kind of endearing for just how wacky this thing is, and it still manages to maintain a sense of humor. But the plot itself is just so out there and so ridiculous it ends up just kind of falling flat on its face. You're just sitting there going, well, I'm glad that the game is not taking itself seriously, but this plot's just all over the damn place, and it really isn't all that compelling. But fortunately for the game, it still has some very well-made campaigns, which honestly I've always thought is the biggest strength of the Command & Conquer series. So at least they kept that going with this one. But then there's the gameplay additions. They did do some tweaking to the various factions. For example, adding the Guardian GI unit to the Allies, which is basically just a really heavy infantry unit that's better against vehicles, as well as other things to the various arsenals that the Allies and Soviets have. But it also throws in the Yuri faction, where you get to play as Yuri's psychic, nonsensically ridiculous faction. And so you're dealing with a lot of psychics, with a lot of light vehicles, with weird mutants that are just completely out there and you don't really expect. And it's a really weird faction, and it's not exactly easy to play right, but if you know what you're doing as Yuri, Yuri's faction is insanely overpowered. To give you an idea, Yuri's basic infantry unit, the Initiate, sets things on fire with its mind, and that means it's good against both infantry and vehicles. And particularly when you mass them, or if you garrison them in buildings, then they get ridiculously powerful ridiculously quickly, especially if you garrison them. They actually get significant bonuses when they're garrisoned. So if they're in a building and something comes by, it's basically melted within seconds. And this kind of unit can actually destroy even friggin' Apocalypse tanks that the Soviets get, their super heavy tank, in a matter of seconds. It is ridiculous dealing with the Yuri faction. But again, they just kind of have this weird, unorthodox playstyle that really takes a lot of getting used to. But even then, they're only available in skirmish and multiplayer. So right off the bat, you're limiting your exposure to the Yuri faction, but even then, if you go and try to play this thing in multiplayer and you got somebody who knows what they're doing as Yuri, you're going to hate them for it because, again, they are incredibly overpowered if somebody who's playing them actually has even a vague clue of what they're doing. And it's not even just things like the ridiculously powerful units that Yuri gets, it's also the psychic abilities that he gets, where you can reveal sections of the map incredibly quickly into the game, and you can also actually convert units to your side. And that quickly becomes incredibly irritating if you're on the receiving end of it. And ultimately, that becomes the biggest problem with this game. The balancing is just completely broken. It was already kind of a mess in the original Red Alert 2, and it was just clearly a game that you weren't supposed to take all that seriously and just were supposed to have fun with. But Yuri's Revenge ultimately just breaks the game in terms of balancing just by introducing the Yuri faction. Now, you're probably going to be like, well, you can just play as the Allies and Soviets and completely forget that the Yuri faction exists. Sure you can, and the tweaks to those various factions are certainly appreciated, but ultimately, what's the point of getting the expansion pack if you don't want to play with the new content? I mean, the campaigns are still fun, even though now you're going to run into problems with fighting the Yuri faction, and that's just going to be irritating. But even then, that's not enough to derail the campaigns. But it's kind of hard to recommend this thing purely on the basis of it completely destroying what semblance of balance the original Red Alert 2 had. So, if you were looking to play this thing multiplayer, just establish the rule beforehand that nobody plays Yuri. Ever. Because, again, it breaks the game. Other than that, the tweaks are nice to have, and so you got some new units for your various factions to play around with. And on top of that, what few tweaks to the engine there were are certainly appreciated. But then there's the really big elephant in the room, which is, of course, the fact that the game doesn't work. At least it certainly doesn't work right on my end. Again, this thing crashes within about 10 minutes every single time I try to play it. So, it's just downright infuriating trying to get this thing to work properly. Nothing I have done has managed to get this thing working right. And it's somehow less stable than Red Alert 2 was, which crashed really often anyway. At least, again, on modern operating systems. You might be luckier than me, and hopefully you are if you do decide to try this thing out, but ultimately, I really can't recommend Yuri's Revenge, except for the people who just really like the campaigns, particularly with Red Alert 2, and just want more of that. But even then, it's a pretty hard recommendation for that, just because of how unstable this thing is on modern operating systems. Thanks for watching.